This past week, for the first time, peace in the Taiwan Strait and China's growing military power was highlighted by the Group of Seven, or G7, and by NATO as U.S. President Joe Biden took his first trip to Europe to strengthen the Western alliance. Perhaps not by coincidence, on Tuesday, Taiwan saw a record-high number of Chinese warplanes enter its air defense identification zone. Let's take a look.
On June 15th, 28 Chinese warplanes made an incursion into southeastern Taiwan's air defense identification zone. That's the most Chinese planes to enter the zone since April 12th, when 25 Chinese planes flew close to Taiwan. The U.S.'s Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group entered the South China Sea on Monday, and some specialists say that's why China is ramping up its presence in the region. One expert says China, which claims Taiwan as part of its territory, is trying to send a message. Over the past few months, U.S. President Joe Biden has met with Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga and Korean President Moon Jae-in. Maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait was a primary talking point at both of those meetings. Earlier this week, the G7 summit also published a statement which once again underscored the importance of peace in the Taiwan region. Military experts say that the Chinese government is having none of it, and its maneuvers around Taiwan show that. They say that Beijing feels threatened, and that's why it's flexing its might near Taiwan. Air Force Deputy Commander Zhang Yanting says that China's actions put pressure on Taiwan's eastern air defenses. He says that Taiwan's Air Force still has room for improvement. For example, Taiwan's missile defenses need upgrading if it is to successfully fend off an attack.
Now, China's gray zone warfare on Taiwan is a global threat. I recently spoke with a top China military expert at Stanford University, Oriana Skylar Mastro. She recently wrote an article for Foreign Affairs magazine about why she believes Beijing could attack Taiwan soon. She is also a strategic planner for the United States Air Force Reserve. She recently testified to the U.S. Congress that she believes China could attack Taiwan within 2 years. I asked her why she thinks so.
I think a lot of the wisdom that China would never want to risk a war with the United States is somewhat outdated. China, of course, of the 1990s, when we had the third Taiwan Strait crisis, and the United States sailed 2 aircraft battle groups in the vicinity of the Taiwan Strait, China backed down. But that was largely because it did not have the military power to persevere, and it also didn't have the economic and political power to protect itself from costs of use of force. That's no longer the case. China has basically embarked on a foreign policy strategy to ensure that countries, for the most part, would stay out of a Taiwan issue. And they've embarked on a very impressive military reform campaign, which for a component of it ended in 2020. And so now they do have the ability to take Taiwan by force. So this, coupled with Xi Jinping's statements, which suggests that he would like to resolve the issue sooner rather than later, points to a change, in my mind, of China's emphasis away from peaceful reunification towards a policy of armed reunification.
I also asked her what the U.S. and its allies could do to deter China.
Well, we get into some maybe technical details, but one of the first things the United States needs to do is have more land-based missiles, probably in the second island chain. So a lot of people think that if the war is costly for China, they won't do it. I disagree with that. I think if China gets Taiwan, even if it costs them their navy, they're willing to take that risk. And so I really think we need to focus on developing military capabilities designed to physically stop the Chinese from sailing across the strait. So something like having missile capabilities that you could saturate the strait with missiles would be sufficient to stop that type of amphibious landing. So that's where I think initially the focus should be. But I do think that if Xi Jinping thought that an attack on Taiwan could threaten China's rejuvenation, for example, if he thought that U.S. allies and partners would cut off trade ties indefinitely with Beijing if they attacked Taiwan, he wouldn't do it. Right? China's trade, over 60% of it depends on the United States and its allies. The problem is that China has basically set up a foreign policy strategy to convince other countries that Taiwan is a unique case. How China treats Taiwan should not be taken as indicative of, what type of country China is. And so I think a lot of people within the Chinese government think for the most part, countries will stay out. So we have to be able to signal that, no, the world after an attack on Taiwan will not be favorable towards Beijing.
Now, what would a US-China war over Taiwan look like? Well, this is what Mastro said.
It completely depends on the scenario. So the US military is far superior to the Chinese military, but wars are not won and lost on that alone. The nearest part of the Taiwan Strait is 80 miles, right? China could possibly get to Taiwan, occupy Taiwan, sign a peace treaty with the government of Taiwan before the United States even gets there. And then it's going to be very difficult for a US president to fire on China if no war is currently ongoing. If, for whatever reason, the United States gets adequate warning, is able to amass forces in the region, or if the war becomes protracted in some way, then I think the United States has the advantage. But Chinese strategists also know that. And that's why they're primarily designing campaigns for quick fait accompli victories.
Wow. And what do you imagine that to look like?
So some Chinese sources have put that in a number of hours, that they could take complete control of Taiwan in 100 hours. I've seen in some Chinese sources. There was a RAND war game that estimated it more in a number of days, or at the high end, a number of weeks. But when it comes to planning major military operations, that's relatively quick, and it could be a lot longer before the United States can actually physically come to Taiwan's aid. And that's why it's so important that Taiwan is able to defend itself. I don't think anyone has the expectation that Taiwan can defeat the PRC. The question is, how long can Taiwan hold out to give the United States time to come to its aid? And even small increments, like an extra week or two, could be the difference between victory and defeat.
So you think that the U.S. would come to Taiwan to defend if China attacks? I think that's what we hear about most of the time.
Oh, I think absolutely. I think that's something, the big question is, if we have enough time to do what's necessary to achieve our goals. But, a lot of people who argue otherwise, it might also be a generational thing. The U.S. military of today, these are people who have volunteered and signed up, that have a vision of the world that they're willing to sacrifice their lives to protect. This isn't, Vietnam era America. And so I do see very strong morale and very strong willingness in the United States to do, what is right. And so I have full confidence that my country would come to the aid of Taiwan and to other allies and partners in the region. The question is, how costly is that going to be?
Now, we talked in depth about the possibility of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. The whole interview is on Facebook and YouTube.